Hey guys, tonight we are wandering into the strange, windswept world of medieval Iceland, where the ground is rocky, the sheep are moody, and the neighbors are so interesting or maybe just so annoying that people decided to turn their everyday lives into literature that still survives. You picture yourself trudging across lava fields with a wind that feels like trying to peel the skin off your face, while all around you the landscape is mostly black. Rock patches of grass, and the occasional sheep staring as if it knows your deepest secrets. In this kind of environment, you either make stories or you lose your mind, and Icelanders chose the former. And honestly, you probably wouldn't survive this climate without either very thick wool or a very good imagination. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love if you could post your location and the local time in the comments. I always find it fascinating to see where in the world people are listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin by stepping into a world where words matter almost more than food, because food rots and gets stolen by the neighbor's sheep. But words, once written, cling stubbornly to the page. The people around you are not rich, not powerful, not kings and queens with crowns and armies, but farmers and fishers, whose main hobby is keeping grudges alive through stories. Historians still argue whether it was boredom, vanity, or survival that pushed Icelanders to record their neighbors' daily squabbles. But the fact is undeniable. This windswept island became one of the most literary cultures of the Middle Ages. As you walk across the rugged land, you can smell the salt of the sea and the smoke of turf fires clinging to woolen clothes. This is a place with hardly any trees to cut down, so people build houses from dirt and stone. But what they build in words lasts longer than oak. You find yourself standing outside a lore-fit turf house, the kind that seems to sink into the earth. Smoke curling from the roof like the house itself is sighing, and inside, stories are waiting. The sagas they write aren't about magical dragons or distant kings in faraway lands, though. To be fair, a sea monster or two does sneak in, but mostly about that guy 3 farms over who wouldn't share his hay. This doesn't sound thrilling, but in Icelandic hands, the story of a hay dispute becomes epic, with insults sharpened into weapons and grudges carried through generations. You'll realize that in a place with long winters and limited entertainment, everyone is both hero and villain in someone else's tale. The mainstream historical fact is that medieval Iceland produced hundreds of sagas, from family histories to poems about gods, but what surprises you is how many of them focus not on kings, but on the neighbors. Your everyday farmer, law speaker, or fisherman. Unlike the big epics of France or England, which sang of knights and crusades, Icelanders turned gossip into art. And here's the quirky tidbit. Some sagas spend pages just describing who attended a feast, right down to the seating order. Because in Iceland, who sat where was basically Game of Thrones politics. You imagine walking into one of these feasts where the air is thick with smoke, the walls lined with flickering tallow lamps, and the smell of boiled lamb clings to everything. People crowd together on benches, wrapped in heavy cloaks, their breath visible in the chill, and stories begin. A man leans forward, lowering his voice as if confessing a crime, and says, "Do you remember when Thorvald refused to lend his axe?" Everyone nods solemnly, because that, apparently, is the stuff of legend. The strange reality check hits you. In this culture, your awkward argument with your neighbor about property lines could literally outlive you for centuries. Written in calfskin parchment and copied again and again. Your passive-aggressive fencing dispute would one day be studied by PhD students in faraway universities. And you thought Facebook drama lasted too long? The land itself almost demands storytelling. The winters are endless, the nights so long you forget what daylight feels like. And the sound of wind rattling against turf walls makes silence unbearable. Words become the fire you can carry in your mouth. Historians still argue whether Iceland's isolation fostered this obsession with storytelling, or whether it was the Norse cultural baggage brought by settlers from Norway. But either way, you sense that language became a survival tool. As you close your eyes, you picture yourself lying inside one of those turf houses, smoke burning your eyes, the roof so low you can touch it, the cold seeping up from the floor. Outside, the wind howls like an angry ghost, but inside, voices rise and fall in rhythm, shaping stories that make the night shorter, that make the neighbors unforgettable. The sagas are not entertainment alone. They're the way people carve meaning into a land that offers so little else. And just as the smoke clings to your wool, these words cling to history. You can almost feel the scratch of a quill on vellum, the ink dark against pale calfskin. As some monk or farmer decides that your neighbor's bad temper deserves to be immortalized. It's ridiculous, and it's beautiful, and it's the beginning of your long walk through Iceland's sag-loving culture. You walk a little farther across the wind-battered land, and what strikes you now is how every small farm feels less like a humble homestead and more like a miniature kingdom, each ruled by a stubborn farmer who treats his few acres of hay and sheep as if they were a crown and scepter. The landscape doesn't allow for grandeur. No castles rise here, no marble halls gleam, only turf houses pressed into the earth. Their roofs sprouting grass like unkempt hair, but inside them, pride burns as hot as any royal court. You push open a heavy wooden door and step into a dim interior, where sheep bleat faintly outside and smoke from a central hearth stings your eyes. And you realize that the family gathered here treats their farmstead with the same formality that kings treat their thrones. A bench in the corner holds the eldest, his back stiff, his voice authoritative. And the younger sons sit along the wall, quiet and watchful, learning the art of ruling through hay counts and grazing rights. Each farm becomes a theater where neighbors measure one another not in jewels or armies, but in the number of sheep that graze on a hillside, the amount of butter churned in a season, and the quality of hay stacked in a barn. Historians still argue whether Iceland's obsession with chronicling these farm-based feuds was an echo of noble ideals brought from Norway, or simply the island's unique way of turning survival into status. The mainstream historical fact here is that Iceland, in the medieval period, had no king on the island at all politically. It was a commonwealth run through assemblies and law speakers, not through monarchs, so the grandeur of royalty was miniaturized into the turf farms themselves. And the quirky tidbit is that farmers sometimes named their favorite cows, not just for affection, but because these animals appeared in legal disputes and sagas. And yes, the cow's name made it onto parchment as if she were a witness. You can picture two farmers standing on opposite sides of a field, the wind tugging at their cloaks, arguing over whether one cow's grazing nose had crossed the invisible line between their properties. Each man convinced that the fate of his honor rested on the animal's appetite. From your 21st century perspective, it seems absurd, but here, that argument can ignite a feud remembered for generations. Imagine if today's neighborhood squabbles over recycling bins were preserved in leather-bound manuscripts, though to be fair, some of your neighbors might deserve it. The turf house smells of smoke and wool, and the sound of a spinning wheel whirs quietly in the background. But the farmer's voice fills the room as he recounts how a neighbor once tried to cut hay early, before it was agreed upon, an act as scandalous as theft. You feel the tension in the air, every listener leaning forward, and realize that even small details of fence moved. A sheep lost become the seeds of epic storytelling. The walls of the house seem to press in closer as the tale unfolds. The flicker of the hearth dancing across rough-hewn beams. And you sense how deeply this culture equates ownership of land with dignity itself. Losing hay isn't just losing fodder, it's losing face. And face is what will be remembered in the saga. The family's eyes gleam as they imagine future generations whispering their names. Their struggles with neighbors elevated to literature. In your own head, you joke that maybe Icelanders were the original reality TV producers taking the smallest, pettiest conflicts and spinning them into multi-season dramas. But unlike television, these dramas were carved into calfskin and carried forward for centuries. Even now, you can hear the pride in the farmer's voice as he insists that his grandfather's quarrel with the man downriver is worth retelling, again and again. Step outside once more, and the wind greets you like a slap, carrying with it the sound of sheep bells clinking faintly across the valley. Each farm is distant from the next, but that distance only fuels the need to assert importance. When you rarely see your neighbor, you must make the meetings dramatic enough to remember. Historians still argue whether Iceland's saga culture was meant to unify communities through shared memory or to compete for prestige in who could tell the best story. But either way, the farmers' kingdom image persists. You look across the hills at the turf houses dotting the horizon, their grassy roofs blending into the land. And you understand why these people loved writing sagas. Each one is a throne room, each one a castle, and each stubborn farmer a monarch whose crown is a simple woolen hood. And when the scribes sat down to write, they were not just preserving history. They were preserving the royal dignity of neighbors who ruled tiny kingdoms of mud, stone, and sheep. You step back into the turf house, and now the focus shifts not on sheep or fences, but on the warm glow of firelight and the sound of voices weaving memory into threads that hold a whole community together. The hearth crackles with peat and driftwood, smoke curling upward toward a hole in the roof, and around it men and women sit in a circle, drinking ale from carved wooden cups, their breath rising like mist in the cold night. The room smells of wet wool, smoke, and the faint sour temps of fermenting grain. Yet what dominates isn't the food or drink, but the flow of stories passed from mouth to mouth like a torch. You sit cross-legged, cup in hand, and watch as an elder, his beard yellowed with smoke, begins to speak of events long past, his voice steady, his memory sharper than any written page. In a world with no printing presses, no hard drives, and no internet cloud to back up your files, memory is the only archive, and people treat it with reverence. The mainstream historical fact is that Icelanders preserved their sagas orally for generations before committing them to vellum. Professional storytellers, called sagnamenn, carried the tales from farm to farm, ensuring that no winter night went without entertainment. The quirky tidbit is that some sagas may have been performed with subtle gestures or dramatic pauses, almost like stage plays, and listeners judged the skill of the storyteller as much as the tale itself. Historians still argue whether the later written sagas were faithful transcripts of these oral performances or creative rewrites by literate scribes. You sip your ale, which tastes more like sour bread soup than the hoppy drinks you know, and the warmth of it seeps into your stomach. As the elder's words wrap around the room, he recalls feuds and reconciliations, sheep counts and hay harvests. But in his telling, each detail grows larger than life, transformed by the cadence of his voice. You realize that memory here is not passive, it's active, a tool sharpened and displayed, a way of proving your worth. The younger listeners lean forward, eyes bright, eager to absorb every phrase so they can repeat it later, maybe with their own spin. You imagine a child whispering the tale to a sibling by firelight, changing a phrase here, exaggerating a gesture there, and slowly, the story mutates into something half familiar, half new. The act of remembering becomes the act of creating, and creation is what keeps the saga alive. Outside, the wind rattles the turf walls, but inside, the voices hold the night at bay. A woman with a sharp tongue interrupts to remind the elder of a detail he has conveniently softened. How the neighbor actually borrowed the axe without asking, not with permission, and the room erupts with laughter. Even here, you see how memory is contested, shaped not just by fact, but by community negotiation. You think of your own modern life, where arguments about who said what last week can spiral into absurd debates. And imagine if every small detail had to be memorized by the entire village. Suddenly, forgetting seems less like absent-mindedness and more like a social crime. You joke silently to yourself. Forget your spouse's birthday once in Iceland, and boom, you've just created saga material for the next 5 generations. The fire pops, sending sparks into the smoky air, and another man begins to speak, his voice younger, faster, but just as compelling. He tells of a feast where 2 neighbors traded insults so sharp they cut deeper than any sword. And everyone around you nods, smiling, because they all remember the story too. Though each memory differs in the tiniest ways. You notice how no one pulls out a parchment to check the fact's truth here. I send tea about accuracy. But about resonance, about what the community agrees to remember. Historians still argue whether these communal memories were reliable accounts of history or simply social myths constructed to explain identity. But in the firelit moment, you understand that accuracy is secondary. What matters is belonging. If you remember the story, you belong to the group, and the group belongs to you. The ale continues to flow, the cups are refilled, and the smoke thickens until your eyes water. But you don't want to step outside because the voices hold you fast. Someone recites poetry, a skaldic verse so intricate it feels like twisting rope. Each line packed with metaphors that link sheep, gods, and human pride together. You marvel at how these people, living on the edge of survival, still carve beauty into every line. As the night deepens, the fire grows low. But the stories keep. Tumbling out of ancestors of neighbors of feuds long past, and you feel as though you slipped into the bloodstream of a culture that prizes memory as both armor and ornament. Without written words, memory is survival, and so every person at the fire becomes both witness and guardian of the saga. And as you rest your head against the turf wall, lulled by the cadence of voices and the taste of sour ale, you realize that this is how neighbors became. Immortal through stories carried on tongues, warmed by firelight, night after endless night. You leave the smoky hearth behind and follow the trail of words out into the daylight, where another side of saga making reveals itself not in memory alone, but in the sharp scratch of quills across vellum. Picture a neighbor pulling a feather from a seabird, trimming it with a knife, until it tapers to a point. Then, dipping it into a thick black ink brewed from soot and fish oil, the smell as pungent as the harbor at low tide. The saga culture of Iceland isn't just oral, it becomes physical, carved into animal skin with tools that feel improvised from the sea and the land. You sit beside a scribe hunched over a wooden desk, his cloak wrapped tightly against the chill seeping through stone walls, and watch the slow, careful strokes form words that carry centuries of gossip, feuds, and jokes. The sound of scratching fills the room, a rhythm as steady as a heartbeat. And you realize that the pen becomes as important as the plow in this world. Historians still argue whether most scribes were monks trained in Latin script or ordinary farmers with literacy. But either way, the manuscripts that remain suggest that even remote turf houses harbored a passion for ink. The mainstream historical fact here is that medieval Iceland produced manuscripts like the Icelandic family sagas written on vellum made from calfskin, preserved in collections that survive to this day. The quirky tidbit is that Icelanders sometimes repurposed older manuscripts by scraping away the ink to reuse the vellum, a practice called palimpsesto, behind your neighbor's story of a hay feud. There might literally be faint traces of a sermon about St. Augustine. The ink itself is crude but enduring. You lean closer and catch the oily tang of lampblack, a mixture of soot collected from lamps mixed with fish guts or cow gall. It doesn't sound appetizing, but when brushed onto vellum, it forms lines that have outlasted entire dynasties. Imagine someone bottling gossip in squid ink and handing it to the future. You'll realize that essentially what's happening here. The scribe shifts, rubbing his cramped hand, and mutters about the cold. And you realize the labor of writing is not romantic, but grueling. Hours of hunching over dim light, squinting to form letters, dipping quills repeatedly into a sticky pot. All so that the story of how Bjorn insulted Thorstein at a feast might never be forgotten. You can help but smile at the absurdity. The aches and ink stains of one farmer ensure that a petty neighbor dispute travels across centuries. Outside, gulls cry over the gray sea, their feathers glinting in the weak light. And you realize that the quills in the scribe's hand may have come from those very birds. Iceland lacks many resources, no broad forests for parchment factories, no mines for ink, but what it does have is ingenuity. Historians still argue whether this scarcity drove Icelanders to value words more dearly, since producing a single manuscript could require months of labor and the sacrifice of an entire herd's worth of calfskins. You feel the texture of vellum under your fingers, smoother than paper, almost waxy, yet tough enough to survive the centuries. Each page is heavy, each letter deliberate, and the weight of it reminds you that stories here are not ephemeral. They are investments of time, labor, and animal life. The neighbor's feud is not just entertainment. It is a permanent engraving into the body of the land itself, since even the calf whose skin holds the words once grazed Icelandic fields. The scribe pauses, reading aloud what he has written, his voice echoing in the dim room, and you hear the names of people who once quarreled over sheep and hay. Their voices are gone, their turf houses collapsed into mossy mounds. But on the page, they remain sharp, alive, as if their personalities have seeped into the ink. You marvel at how a culture so isolated, so starved of resources, still insisted on the permanence of its words. The joke creeps into your mind. Icelanders basically invented medieval neighborhood Facebook. Only their wall posts were carved into calfskin with squid ink and took 3 weeks to write. So you couldn't just rage comment and delete it later. Once it was down forever, and future generations had no choice but to deal with it. The room grows colder as the day wears on, the only warmth coming from a small lamp sputtering against the gloom. The scribe continues his steady scratching, quill dipping, words flowing, and you feel the hypnotic rhythm of preservation. One neighbor's annoyance becomes another's pride, then a line on vellum, then a manuscript copied and recopied until it survives into your own time. As you lean closer, you realize you're not just watching writing. You're witnessing the moment when gossip becomes history, when the ink of everyday life seeps permanently into the bones of a culture. You follow the trail of ink-stained fingers and vellum pages into a world where words are not just private notes, but public law, recited aloud in booming voices so everyone can hear. Remember, and let's be honest, argue about them later. You find yourself standing at a gathering known as the Althing, Iceland's National Assembly, where farmers, chieftains, and law speakers meet on a grassy plain surrounded by jagged cliffs. The air smells of damp earth, roasting meat, and too many sheep crammed into one valley, and the noise of arguments swirls like gulls over the crowd. At the center of it all stands the Ligi Skúmur, the law speaker, a man chosen for his memory, not his sword. His job is to recite the law aloud, word for word, because there's no printed copy, no court stenographer, no handy PDFs. He chants the rules like a bard, his voice rising above the murmurs, reminding everyone when grazing rights begin, how marriages are arranged, and what fine is due if your cow tramples your neighbor's cabbage. It feels less like a court case and more like open mic night, only the audience is armed with axes. The mainstream historical fact is that the Althing, founded around 930, is one of the world's oldest parliamentary institutions, a place where law was recited orally before being slowly written down in the Graga's law codes. The quirky tidbit is that the law speaker didn't actually make new laws. He just memorized the old ones and repeated them, which sounds like the most exhausting karaoke gig in history. Historians still argue whether this oral tradition preserved the law faithfully, or whether law speakers accidentally edited rules to benefit their allies. You edge closer through the throng. hearing fragments of the law recited, punishments for theft, procedures for duels, details about inheritance, all delivered in a voice meant to be both neutral and absolute. Yet you notice how every farmer listening already prepares his rebuttal, muttering under his breath, ready to twist the words into his own favor. The law is not fixed. It's alive, shaped by memory and interpretation, and sagas thrive in this ambiguity. A sheep wanders into the crowd, bleating pitifully, and someone shoves it back toward the pens, but the interruption doesn't break the rhythm of the speaker's voice. His words echo against the cliffs, sounding both grand and oddly petty, because half of them boil down to, "Don't let your animals ruin your neighbor's stuff." You can't help but chuckle. So many sagas of blood, honor, and vengeance all begin with livestock behaving badly. The listeners murmur, some nodding in agreement, others shaking their heads. And you feel the tension of a society where words themselves are weapons. Forget swords. A clever insult at the Althing can wound more deeply than a blade because it's witnessed by the whole community and etched into memory. You imagine a farmer leaving the assembly not with bruises, but with the satisfaction that he verbally outdueled his rival, knowing the insult will be carried into the sagas. Historians still argue whether the sagas exaggerate the importance of these assemblies or faithfully depict them. But you can see how easily they lend themselves to storytelling. The stage is perfect. A crowd of neighbors, a dramatic speaker, the stakes high enough to ruin reputations. And unlike your modern courtroom dramas, there's no judge's gavel, only the force of memory and community agreement. The smell of roasting meat grows stronger as the day stretches on, and feasting mingles with law-giving, making the atmosphere a bizarre mix of party and parliament. Someone offers you a cup of sour ale, and as you sip, you realize that for these farmers, the law is entertainment as much as governance. No wonder it spills into sagas. The legal disputes themselves are narratives performed before a captive audience. You watch as one man accuses another of trespassing sheep, his voice cracking with fury, while his opponent retorts with equal passion, citing precedent from 5 winters ago. The crowd roars with laughter at a sharp insult, and you realize you're essentially witnessing a medieval courtroom drama crossed with stand-up comedy. The outcome matters. Of course, land and honor are at stake, but so does the performance. And every performance has the potential to become saga material. By evening, the law speaker's voice is hoarse, and the crowd begins to disperse, some satisfied, others plotting revenge. You linger on the plain, hearing echoes of disputes carried on the wind, and you understand why Icelanders loved turning these assemblies into stories. They weren't just about rules. They were about personalities, performances, and reputations that could echo far longer than the grazing rights themselves. The law in Iceland was drama, and drama always finds its way to parchment. You drift from the grassy plain of the assembly back toward the quiet of the farms, and now you notice how neighbors themselves become legends. Their ordinary deeds inflated into tales with the weight of epic poetry. You walk down a narrow path between mossy stones, hearing sheep shuffle in the distance. And suddenly you recall the farmer who once stole a handful of hay, not an act of grandeur, but in Icelandic sagas, it's enough to make him infamous for centuries. Inside a turf house, the family gathers again by firelight, the smell of boiled lamb thick in the air, and someone begins retelling that story of stolen hay. You listen as it grows larger with each retelling. The thief isn't just sneaky, he's cunning. The victim isn't just slighted, he's noble. The insult isn't just petty, it's cosmic. You realize that Icelanders had a talent for turning everyday pettiness into high art. The kind of talent modern television networks would envy. The mainstream historical fact is that sagas often focused on local farmers and chieftains, not distant kings, with stories of land disputes, marriages, and family rivalries forming the backbone of Icelandic literature. The quirky tidbit is that some characters are remembered more for their witty insults than for their deeds verbal sparring could immortalize. You faster than swordplay. Historians still argue whether saga authors deliberately exaggerated these characters for entertainment or whether people in medieval Iceland were simply that dramatic in real life. The more you listen, the more you notice the rhythm of exaggeration. A neighbor who once tripped in the mud becomes clumsy for eternity. His descendants teased in stories for generations. A farmer who shared his food during a harsh winter becomes generous beyond measure, remembered as a saintly figure. Reality blends with memory until you can't tell where fact ends and performance begins. The fire crackles, shadows leap across turf walls, and you think of how your own embarrassing slip at the grocery store might in this world become a saga. And lo, he did drop the jar of pickles, and the green brine flowed like a river through the aisles. It's both ridiculous and oddly flattering. The thought that your life, however mundane, might echo for centuries if retold with enough gravitas. A boy by the hearth speaks up, reciting an insult he's learned from older relatives, and the room erupts in laughter. It's not just the words, but the delivery, the timing, the memory of who first said it and under what circumstances. The insult becomes property, treasured and repeated like a family heirloom, passed down with pride. You realize that sagas weren't just about swords and blood. They were about words, about neighbors sharpening language into weapons. Historians still argue whether Icelanders wrote sagas as warnings, cautionary tales about feuds gone too far, as entertainment to keep neighbors' egos alive. But either way, you sense that immortality here isn't earned by building monuments or conquering empires, but by simply being memorable in the right moment. Steal hay with enough attitude, deliver a clever insult, and congratulations, you've entered literature. You step outside for air, the cold night biting at your skin, and see the stars glittering above, sharp and clear against the dark. Somewhere across the valley, another farm tells its own stories, elevating their neighbors into legends, reshaping the community's memory one tale at a time. You can almost hear the ripple effect, the way gossip turns into anecdote, anecdote into performance, and performance into saga. The joke crosses your mind that medieval Iceland was basically one giant neighborhood drama club, where everyone auditioned for the role of most memorable character. Some succeeded with bravery, others with foolishness. But either way, the saga made sure they were remembered. And you, sitting by the fire, realize you've been drafted into their world. A witness to the transformation of petty human quirks into immortal lines of prose. As you close your eyes against the night, the stories linger in your ears, and you understand that Icelanders didn't need kings or battles to create epics. All they needed was a neighbor, a quarrel, and the will to remember. And in this land of turf and stone, that was enough to make legends. You settle back inside the turf house. And now the attention turns to the women who sit near the hearth, their fingers busy with weaving or knitting, but their voices just as sharp as any man's sword. You notice how farmwives, mothers, and daughters shape sagas with the precision of a practiced storyteller, their observations cutting to the heart of a neighbor's pride or folly. One woman leans forward, recounting how her sister-in-law argued over a basket of wool. And the room bursts into quiet chuckles, because in Iceland, even domestic disputes are saga-worthy. The mainstream historical fact is that women played a significant role in the preservation and telling of Icelandic sagas both orally and later in writing, influencing the portrayal of family, morality, and cleverness. The quirky tidbit is that some sagas celebrate women for outwitting men in legal disputes, turning arguments over property or animals into stories of cunning and respect, effectively giving them literary immortality. Historians still argue whether these portrayals accurately reflect women, social power, or are narrative devices to entertain male audiences. You watch a woman recount an argument from years past, her voice rising and falling like the sea outside. And you realize that her wit shapes how future generations perceive the story. A simple exchange over butter or wool is turned into a narrative of strategy and cunning, the kind that would make modern lawyers blush with admiration. Even the youngest children lean in, absorbing the cadence and the moral, learning how to navigate relationships with sharp minds and careful words. The fire crackles, sending little sparks onto the rough-hewn floor. And you think about how these tales elevate the mundane. The women remember details that men might forget: the exact wording of an insult, the color of the cloak worn during a disagreement, the number of sheep involved in a minor quarrel. And these details become essential when the saga is finally committed to parchment. Accuracy in small things ensures the story resonates, even centuries later. Outside, the wind rattles the turf roof, but inside, the voices form a kind of rhythm that keeps the chill at bay. A mother recalls how a neighbor attempted to cheat during a feast game, and the retelling transforms a minor social misstep into an epic moral lesson. You can't help but smile at the universality of it. Petty arguments, clever comebacks, and social maneuvering are timeless. And Icelanders understood that storytelling is a way to teach, warn, and entertain all at once. Historians still argue whether women's roles in these narratives were underrepresented in written form, or whether oral tradition allowed them more influence than surviving manuscripts. Suggest but you feel the presence of these voices in every crackling story. Their influence is palpable. Without them, the sagas would be less nuanced, less human, and frankly, less fun. You notice how humor threads through their retellings. A gentle sarcasm aimed at neighbors and relatives alike, which makes the stories enjoyable but also memorable. A mismanaged sheepfold, a lost spindle, or a mistimed insult becomes a narrative pivot. And you realize that the women's sharp observation is what ensures these sagas sparkle with life rather than reading like dull court records. As the night stretches, the sagas swirl together. The clever woman, the boastful man, the mischievous child, all woven into a tapestry of community memory. You feel a sense of warmth and intimacy as each voice contributes, building a cultural record that survives not because of kings or conquests, but because of ordinary people paying attention to ordinary life. You imagine a modern audience reading these tales and underestimating the subtle power of women behind the stories. Yet here, in the flickering light of a turf house, their influence is undeniable. They are the architects of reputation, the chroniclers of personality, and the keepers of the small, sharp truths that make every neighbor unforgettable. And as you lean back, listening to the murmur of storytelling and the occasional laugh at a remembered insult, you understand that Icelandic women were not just participants. They were essential to the creation and survival of sagas shaping the narrative. With wit, intelligence, and a quiet authority that echoes across the centuries. You step outside into the lengthening shadows of the Icelandic winter, and immediately you feel the vast, oppressive boredom that stretches for months, the kind that seeps into bones and makes the mind crave stories as fiercely as fire. Snow blankets the ground, wind hammers against the turf houses, and the sun barely rises above the horizon, leaving you in a half-light that encourages reflection, imagination, and, inevitably, storytelling. You trudge through drifts and crunch frozen earth beneath your boots, realizing that isolation is not merely geographic here, it is mental, emotional, and social. Inside, you find neighbors gathered around small fires, wrapped in furs and blankets, faces flushed from the cold and the heat of the hearth. Conversation is sparse at first, then warms like the peat fire, and soon tales begin to emerge. A sheep went missing, a fence was mended incorrectly. A dispute flared over Butterreach event mundane in another land, but here transformed into narrative fuel. Historians still argue whether the extreme winter isolation or the Norse cultural inheritance encouraged this obsessive storytelling, but either way, the result is unmistakable. Winter boredom cultivates epic imagination. The mainstream historical fact is that Iceland's winters were long and brutal, with little daylight for farming or travel, meaning that indoor activities including storytelling occupied much of people's time. The quirky tidbit is that some saga scenes describe snow so deep that travelers had to dig tunnels between houses, which sounds like a desperate attempt at indoor socializing and perhaps an early precursor to elaborate Icelandic snow forts. You settle by a fire, the smoke curling around your nose, and notice how these gatherings function as both entertainment and social glue. People recount minor incidents from earlier in the season, exaggerating insults and embellishing victories. And suddenly, the neighbor who overcooked his mutton is a tragic hero, while the woman who mended a torn cloak becomes a figure of cunning and virtue. In this land of monotony and isolation, narrative creativity is survival. The room smells of burning peat and dried fish, a combination that surprises modern senses. Yet your ears are drawn to the rhythm of speech, the cadence of laughter, the pauses filled with knowing glances. You imagine that without these winter tales, isolation might crush morale. With them, it creates culture. You joke inwardly that Icelanders basically turned cabin fever into a national literary pastime, with each neighbor's minor drama elevated to epic proportions. Outside, wind rattles the turf roofs and shakes the occasional loose stone. And you understand why imagination was not optional here. The landscape itself offers little distraction: lava fields, frozen streams, and occasional sheep grazing against the gray horizon. When nature provides monotony, humans compensate with stories. And these stories slowly solidify into sagas, carrying everyday events into eternity. Historians still argue whether these winter narratives were meant primarily to entertain or to instruct social norms. Cautionary lessons and community memory all intertwined. But you see both purposes at work as neighbors quietly compete for narrative prominence. The minor heroics of repairing a roof or resolving a dispute are narrated with the same intensity as battles in distant lands. A child whispers a retelling of a recent insult, and the elder nods approvingly, adding flourishes that make the story livelier. You sense the apprenticeship of oral storytelling, a rigorous training that turns boredom into skill, memory into art, and gossip into literary treasure. Every listener is a potential narrator, every tale a potential saga. And the cycle of storytelling ensures that the dullest winter day can yield epic consequences. As the fire dies down and the long night presses closer, you lean back in your chair, feeling the combined warmth of wool smoke and narrative. Realizing that Icelandic winters were both a curse and a blessing, they created boredom so intense that the only relief was art, and the only art was the immortalization of everyday neighbors. By necessity, people became storytellers, and by choice, the sagas endure. You rise from the hearth and wander toward the shoreline where the Atlantic crashes against jagged rocks, cold spray stinging your face, and you notice how the sea itself enters the sagas not as a mythical monster, but as a relentless neighbor that must be reckoned with daily. Fishermen and sailors speak of tides, hidden currents, and rogue waves with a seriousness that rivals any feud over hay or livestock. And these oceanic challenges weave themselves seamlessly into everyday storytelling. The mainstream historical fact is that medieval Icelanders relied heavily on the sea for food, trade, and travel, making maritime knowledge an essential part of daily life. The quirky tidbit is that some sagas attribute human-like motives to the waves, describing them as mischievous spirits or stubborn neighbors, which might sound absurd but served as memorable storytelling devices. Historians still argue whether these embellishments reflect genuine belief in supernatural forces or are purely narrative techniques to dramatize ordinary maritime hazards. You follow a fisherman mending nets by hand, his fingers raw from salt and cold, listening to him recount last summer's fishing expedition. A disagreement with another boat over the best fishing spot escalated into a saga-worthy argument, complete with threats, clever wordplay, and eventual reconciliation over shared salt cod. You realize that even minor maritime disputes became fodder for sagas because the audience valued wit, bravery, and social memory above simple success. The wind smells of brine and wet rope and gulls circle overhead, their cries punctuating the stories. You see how the physical environment encourages hyper-awareness. Knowing tides, currents, and weather patterns is a matter of survival, and exaggerating tales of near disasters enhances both prestige and cautionary value. Small missteps, losing a net, spilling fish, or failing to warn a neighbor of shifting ice can grow into legendary mishaps, teaching lessons while entertaining the community. Inside a fisherman's hut, you hear a woman recounting the same events from her perspective, highlighting clever problem-solving rather than sheer luck. Her version shifts the focus from reckless bravery to careful cunning, showing how multiple narratives coexist, each shaping memory and community perception. This multiplicity of voices makes the saga culture rich, dynamic, and at times, hilariously contradictory. Historians still argue whether these variations in storytelling were intended to preserve multiple truths or simply reflect personal biases. But the point is clear. The sea, like neighbors, must be observed, respected, and chronicled. Each story contributes to a communal archive of survival, behavior, and social norms. You notice how humor threads through these maritime narratives of fishermen slipping on wet planks. Another exaggerating the size of a cod, a dispute over who caught the best fish. Icelanders, even in isolation, didn't lack for amusement. Instead, they found in daily labor the material for legendary tales. You imagine that without these stories, the endless monotony of fishing, tending nets, and repairing boats would crush morale, whereas narrative transforms routine into ritual, and ritual into memory. By twilight, the waves shimmer gray and silver, reflecting the fading light. You feel the rhythm of the ocean echoing the rhythm of storytelling, constant, unpredictable, and enduring. In Icelandic culture, even a mundane fishing dispute carries the weight of legend because it reflects courage, cleverness, and community standing. You chuckle at the thought that complaining about a neighbor stealing fish could achieve literary immortality, a distinction far more lasting than any trophy or medal. You lean against the cold rock, listening to distant voices, narrating events both mundane and heroic, and realize that every saga, whether of household disputes, or oceanic exploits, shares a common thread: the meticulous attention to ordinary life, rendered extraordinary by memory, exaggeration, and the art of storytelling. The waves crash, the wind whispers, and you feel how every neighbor, every everyday act, is a note in the long, ongoing melody of saga culture. You turn inland again, feeling the uneven volcanic soil crunch beneath your boots, and notice how Icelandic communities depended on one another, whether for plowing, herding, or feasting, and how these interactions became fertile ground for saga creation. Sharing resources wasn't just practical, it was a social performance. If you lent your neighbor a plow, everyone remembered. If you refused, the slight was immortalized in stories that traveled across valleys. You can see why daily cooperation and competition produced such rich narrative soil. The mainstream historical fact is that Iceland's early settlements were small, often scattered, and heavily reliant on neighborly cooperation for survival. From shared labor to collective defense against environmental threats. The quirky tidbit is that feuds sometimes began over the simplest things, like who got first pick of turnips. And these minor incidents were later expanded into multi-generational sagas. Historians still argue whether these stories exaggerate normal neighborly tensions or reflect genuine social conflict inherent to isolated communities. You watch neighbors gathering for a communal hay harvest, each person's contribution noted with keen interest, as if their social reputation depends on their efficiency and cleverness. Conversations thread through the labor. One man boasts of carrying extra loads. Another whispers about a sly shortcut he used, and the collective gossip feeds into a living narrative. You realize that Icelandic society was as much a theater as it was a survival network. And everyone played a role in both reality and story. The sun glints off peat-stained hands and woven baskets, and you notice how each person's action is remembered. A slip on a hill becomes heroic. A dropped rake becomes comically tragic. The very mundane becomes poetic when observed with attention and retold with embellishment. You can almost hear modern historians sighing over footnotes that begin, "He fell in the hay." But legend says he saved 3 sheep in the process, inside a nearby turf house. Women and children chronicle these same events orally, adding their interpretations, amplifying the humor, and sometimes injecting moral lessons. A small spat over hay allocation is transformed into a story about fairness, cleverness, or family pride, showing that sagas weren't only entertainment, they were social instruction and a record of communal ethics. Historians still argue whether these narratives were meant to preserve legal precedent or simply cement social memory. But either way, they served as cultural glue. You walk past a stone fence, remembering that boundary disputes were a favorite saga motif. One neighbor claims a strip of land, another retorts with genealogical proof. And soon the story spirals into multiple chapters, with insults, clever maneuvers, and occasionally reconciliation. These narratives might seem trivial now, but they were central to how communities understood honor, ownership, and respect. The quirky reality check hits you. In Iceland, a neighbor's misstep or a clever trick could be retold for centuries, affecting reputation long after death. A casual insult, a stolen tool, a generous gesture, all could become immortalized. This obsession with everyday deeds shows why sagas are full of neighbors rather than kings. Ordinary people were both the actors and the audience of their own epics. You pause on a grassy hill, wind tugging at your cloak, and imagine the interconnected network of storytelling. One family's tale of cooperative labor feeds into another's story of mischief, which intertwines with a feud recorded decades earlier. These interlocking narratives make every farm, every action, every neighbor part of an elaborate living tapestry. By evening, you settle near a small fire with the scent of roasted lamb drifting across the valley. The stories circulate again, passed from one person to the next, and you sense the rhythm of Icelandic life: work, observation, embellishment, and preservation. Ordinary neighbors, arguing, cooperating, scheming, and helping become legends, and their ordinary lives transform into extraordinary stories. You chuckle quietly, realizing that in Iceland, storytelling is survival, social negotiation, and entertainment rolled into one. Every mundane moment has epic potential, every neighbor a potential hero or villain, and the landscape itself, stark and challenging, ensures that the saga will continue long after the wind erodes the turf houses into mossy mounds. You leave the communal fire behind and follow a narrow trail along the edge of a frozen river, noticing how water itself dictates the rhythm of life and, by extension, storytelling. Ice can trap you, melt unexpectedly, or flood lowlands, and every farmer must navigate it. Not just for survival, but for reputation. You watch a man break through the thin crust while crossing with a sled, laughter erupting from those on shore as he curses and flails. And you realize that even accidents become narrative gold. The mainstream historical fact is that Iceland's rivers and streams were vital for travel, irrigation, and livestock, yet unpredictable freezing patterns often turned them into natural hazards. The quirky tidbit is that some sagas describe these waterways almost as sentient entities, deliberately impeding or aiding humans depending on their moral worth or cunning. Historians still argue whether these attributions reflect genuine folklore beliefs or are narrative exaggerations, meant to add tension and personality to the landscape. You trudge closer, hearing the echoes of past events carried on the frozen air. A neighbor recalls how his grandfather once crossed the river on a stolen sled to deliver hay, a feat celebrated in multiple family sagas. Each retelling adds drama. The sled nearly overturns, a cow slips, the grandfather curses in verse, and the story grows, layer upon layer, with humor and heroism intertwined. You notice how ordinary moments crossing a river, moving hay, Even slipping on ice become almost mythic in scope. Inside a nearby turf house, someone sketches crude diagrams on the wall with charcoal, showing river crossings, floodplains, and tricky ice patches. These sketches are not maps in the modern sense, but mnemonic devices, visual aids for storytelling that help listeners remember the sequence of events. You marvel at the ingenuity, survival, humor, and memory all converge in a single act. Historians still argue whether these oral maps were standardized or idiosyncratic, dependent on the teller, but you see their practical and narrative value immediately. A farmer's tale of navigating ice isn't just entertainment. It's instruction for the next generation, a warning and a record of cleverness and bravery. Even the mundane act of hauling hay across frozen ground becomes morally and socially significant. The quirky fact that makes you smile is that sometimes entire sagas hinge on these small navigational feats. One wrong step in winter could escalate into a feud, and that feud, in turn, is immortalized in verse and prose. You imagine telling your own office colleagues that their spilled coffee might become legendary centuries later. It's absurd. But in Iceland, minor misadventures were narrative currency. You notice how humor permeates these stories. A neighbor's dramatic slip, a sled overturned in a comedic trajectory, or a boast that ends in embarrassment. These narrative flourishes make the story memorable, and you realize that Icelanders understood long before psychologists that humor is essential for retention. Every chuckle, every gasp ensures that the tale will be told again. Outside, the river glistens under a pale sun, rigid ice contrasting with the fluidity of story. You watch two children play near the bank, and you can almost see them becoming the next generation of storytellers, observing, exaggerating, and remembering every detail. The landscape is harsh, the winters long, and yet the tales proliferate, proof that memory and imagination thrive even in adversity. By dusk, you sit near a turf house, warmth from the fire seeping through wool and leather. Neighbors recount, embellish, and sometimes argue about what actually happened. And you realize that Icelandic sagas are sustained not only by action, but by communal participation, by attentive observation, and by the desire to turn everyday survival into enduring narrative. Every crossing, every slip, every small act of courage contributes to the saga tapestry. And you feel the delicate balance between fact, exaggeration, and performance that makes these stories immortal. You follow a winding trail over black lava fields, dotted with moss, the air smelling faintly of sulfur, and you notice how the Icelandic landscape itself encourages storytelling. The starkness, the isolation, the unpredictable terrain, all these elements make every journey, every encounter, every mistake worth remembering. A neighbor who navigates the rough paths successfully earns prestige. One who falls into a hidden crevice becomes fodder for saga amusement. The mainstream historical fact is that Iceland's topography is volcanic and rugged, creating both challenges and opportunities for isolated communities to interact and observe one another. The quirky tidbit is that some sagas describe enchanted rocks or hidden trolls whose interference explains why a sheep wandered off or a man stumbled. Likely playful exaggeration to enliven the narrative. Historians still argue whether these supernatural elements were literal beliefs or storytelling devices designed to teach caution and entertain. You trudge carefully over sharp lava, recalling how neighbors once raced across these fields to deliver news or resolve disputes, their paths becoming legendary in oral tradition. One misstep could spell minor disaster. And each story adds drama to the everyday. A lost goat becomes a plot twist, a successful shortcut, a heroic feat. These ordinary events, amplified, ensure that no neighbor's deeds go unnoticed. Inside a turf house near the edge of the lava field, children imitate their elders, reenacting past quarrels and cooperative ventures. Their performances blur fact and exaggeration, with every slip, insult, or clever maneuver celebrated. You realize that saga culture functions as an apprenticeship system, teaching the next generation not just survival skills, but also the artistry of narrative and social memory. Historians still argue whether the sagas exaggerate physical challenges or accurately reflect the difficulty of traversing Iceland's terrain. But either way, the stories highlight the significance of human ingenuity, resilience, and social perception. Even something as simple as carrying hay over uneven ground becomes an epic in narrative form. The quirky reality check strikes. You might think you're just walking across rocks, but in this society, your every move could be remembered, recounted, and embellished. One neighbor's heroic feat of hauling firewood could end up immortalized, while another's slip is recast into a humorous moral lesson. Everyday life, therefore, doubles as both entertainment and social ledger. The wind hisses across the fields, carrying with it echoes of stories past. You hear the distant laughter of a group, recalling a feud over grazing boundaries, and realize that these stories also serve to regulate. Behavior, honor, cunning, and cleverness are rewarded with social memory, while misdeeds are recorded for all to witness. This dynamic ensures participation, attention, and creative storytelling. You glance at the moss-covered lava, imagining the generations who have crossed it before you, their steps turning into narrative milestones. Every trek, every quarrel, every small victory or failure contributes to a collective memory that preserves both the land and its people. Icelandic sagas immortalize the ordinary because the landscape itself magnifies it, forcing observation, interaction, and ultimately, storytelling. By twilight, the moss glows dimly under the fading light, and you settle near a turf home with warmth from a peat fire seeping through your cloak. The neighbors' voices mingle with the wind, recounting minor dramas, heroic errands, and clever disputes. You understand that sagas are not abstract epics, but a living record of ordinary life, made enduring by the attentive eyes, exaggerating tongues, and imaginative hearts of the Icelandic people. You leave the rugged lava behind and wander toward a small cluster of farms where livestock bleats and dogs bark, realizing that animal life plays a surprisingly central role in saga storytelling. Sheep, cows, and horses are not mere background. They are catalysts, witnesses, and sometimes even characters in their own right. A lost sheep sparks a dispute, a clever horse outwits its owner, and suddenly, the mundane actions of neighbors become legendary, retold for generations around peat fires. The mainstream historical fact is that livestock was central to Icelandic survival, providing food, clothing, and trade goods, and sagas often record disputes, thefts, and clever handling of these animals. The quirky tidbit is that some sagas describe animals with near-human intelligence as if they have motives, grudges, or cunning rivalries with neighbors, which makes you wonder whether the goat is smarter than the farmer. Historians still argue whether these anthropomorphized depictions reflect actual beliefs or are purely narrative embellishments. To make stories more memorable, you watch a neighbor lead a stubborn sheep down a narrow path, the animal resisting with surprising stubbornness. And you can almost hear the beginnings of a saga forming in the mind of someone observing. Each gesture, grunt, or stubborn pivot is noted, exaggerated, and stored in communal memory. You realize that daily interactions with animals sharpen observation skills, humor, and narrative instincts, making livestock both practical and literary tools. Inside a turf house nearby, children rehearse stories of heroic animals, adding their own twists and flair. A cow that refused to be milked becomes a symbol of stubborn independence. A horse that raced past a neighbor's fence gains legendary speed. Even minor details, like which sheep wore a bell, become significant, showing the meticulous attention Icelanders paid to both humans and animals in narrative construction. Historians still argue whether these animal-centered narratives were symbolic or intended as accurate reflections of daily life. But their prevalence underscores how intertwined humans, animals, and stories were. A well-remembered neighbor dispute often begins with a mundane animal incident, proving that sagas elevate the everyday into the legendary. You notice how humor, exaggeration, and moral lessons thread through these tales. A mischievous goat that ate a neighbor's turnips might result in months of teasing, family pride, or clever revenge, all immortalized in oral tradition. Icelanders understood that these small dramas, enhanced with wit, keep social memory alive, making each neighbor accountable and entertaining. Outside, the sun dips low behind snowy peaks, and you realize how every farm, every animal, every small act of cunning or mischief contributes to a shared cultural memory. The sagas become a network, connecting humans and animals in a living narrative tapestry. You chuckle at the thought that a goat could achieve literary immortality, outshining its human neighbor for cleverness or sheer audacity. By evening, fires glow warmly through turf windows, and neighbors gather recounting animal exploits alongside human feats. You feel the rhythm of communal storytelling, the blending of observation, exaggeration, and memory into enduring sagas. In Iceland, ordinary livestock disputes are elevated to legend. Humor preserves them, and attentive neighbors ensure that these tales persist, shaping culture one sheep, goat, and clever horse at a time. You wander toward the distant hills, where small clusters of turf houses punctuate the frozen landscape, and you notice how storytelling extends beyond mere recording of events, becomes a form of social negotiation. Neighbors use tales to cement alliances, settle disputes, and subtly assert status. And you watch as an argument over grazing rights turns into a saga-worthy narrative, retold with embellishments that highlight cleverness, bravery, or wit. The mainstream historical fact is that Icelandic society depended on complex networks of social obligations, with storytelling serving as a medium for reinforcing rules, reputations, and hierarchies. The quirky tidbit is that some sagas include playful exaggerations where the losing neighbor is made absurdly clumsy or foolish, creating humor while still documenting reality. Historians still argue whether these narrative exaggerations were intended primarily as entertainment, social control, or both. You pause at a hilltop, noticing how subtle gestures, the tilt of a head, a sly smile, a whispered comment carry narrative weight. These small acts are observed, remembered, and eventually narrated, forming the basis for saga episodes that record social dynamics with remarkable accuracy and, occasionally, gentle mockery. Storytelling is therefore both an art and a civic duty, ensuring that deeds, intentions, and character are remembered beyond the fleeting moment. Inside a nearby house, neighbors gather after a day of labor, and tales begin to flow. A disagreement over sheep grazing becomes a tale of strategy and cunning. A negotiation over land boundaries is recast as a moral lesson in patience and foresight. Each retelling reinforces social memory, instructs future behavior, and entertains, blending reality with narrative flair. Historians still argue whether the exaggerated humor in these stories undermines or strengthens the historical reliability of the sagas, but the patterns are clear. Storytelling is a tool for memory, instruction, and amusement. A clever insult, a timely boast, or a mischievous act could ensure a neighbor's legacy, whether revered or ridiculed, long after their daily chores are forgotten. You notice the importance of reputation. A neighbor who cleverly navigates disputes or performs small heroic acts is elevated in community memory, while those who fail become comic figures in retellings. The saga becomes a ledger of social behavior, blending facts, exaggerations, and ethical lessons in a single narrative. And the rhythm of storytelling ensures that even minor events achieve lasting significance. Outside, the wind rustles the sparse grass, carrying the echoes of these tales across valleys. You watch neighbors teaching their children the art of recounting events, emphasizing timing, humor, and embellishment. The landscape, isolated and often harsh, demands both ingenuity and observation. And the sagas reflect this, capturing ordinary life in extraordinary detail. As night falls, you feel the pull of narrative threads weaving together past, present, and future. Each story, each exaggeration, Each subtle observation contributes to a living archive, turning neighborly disputes, acts of cunning, and mundane daily tasks into immortalized lessons, entertainment, and cultural memory. You realize that in Iceland, storytelling is not optional, it is the glue that binds community, landscape, and human imagination. By the hearth, voices grow quieter, smiles linger, and you sense the enduring power of these narratives. Everyday life, observed attentively and recounted creatively, transforms into sagas, ensuring that neighbors both foolish and clever remain alive in collective memory. Long after the moss has claimed the turf houses, you step into the quiet of a long winter evening, the landscape outside muted by snow, and notice how the accumulation of stories has become a living map of Icelandic life. Every neighbor, every minor dispute, every clever trick has been preserved and embellished, creating a network of shared memory that binds communities across valleys and fjords. You feel the hum of history beneath your feet, each turf house a node in a vast storytelling web. The mainstream historical fact is that Icelandic sagas, written from the 12th century onward, chronicle both heroic exploits and everyday events, blending oral tradition with emerging literacy to preserve communal memory. The quirky tidbit is that some sagas describe neighbors' trivial acts like stealing potatoes or tripping over a dog with the same gravity given to major battles, elevating small-scale antics into literary immortality. Historians still argue whether the sagas were primarily intended as historical records or as entertaining, instructive fiction. You walk past a frozen stream where children once played, imagining how those playful interactions became saga material. A child who cleverly avoided punishment or outwitted a sibling might later be described as cunning and brave in the stories, their everyday cleverness magnified by oral tradition. Each tale reflects not only the events themselves, but also the cultural values, humor, and social expectations embedded in Icelandic communities. Inside a turf house, neighbors gather near the fire, sharing stories of the day's work, minor quarrels, or humorous mishaps. Laughter erupts at a neighbor's misfortune. Admiration follows a clever solution to a practical problem. And through this process, ordinary life is transfigured into saga-worthy material. The storytelling cycle reinforces community bonds, social norms, and collective memory. Historians still argue whether saga authors consciously selected which events to immortalize, or whether the community, as attention naturally dictated the narrative focus. But you sense that both individual memory and communal judgment play crucial roles. The sagas capture the texture of daily life, disputes over grazing land, clever manipulations of law, minor accidents, heroic perseverance, and the subtle social dances of rural Iceland. You notice how humor, exaggeration, and moral reflection intertwine. A minor insult might echo for generations. A clever workaround to a tedious chore becomes legendary. Icelandic storytellers had a knack for turning everyday existence into memorable narratives, using ordinary people as protagonists and ordinary deeds as catalysts for enduring tales. Outside, wind and snow mingle, carrying distant echoes of past stories. You realize that the harsh environment, long winters, and isolated geography all contribute to a culture where memory and storytelling are survival tools. Ordinary neighbors, observed carefully and retold creatively, achieve lasting significance in saga literature. By nightfall, the fires are low, voices soften, and the air feels charged with collective memory. You reflect on how sagas immortalize ordinary life, recording cleverness, pettiness, generosity, and folly in equal measure. Each story preserves not just events, but character, humor, and communal norms, forming an intricate tapestry that transcends time. You lean back, listening to the faint crackle of embers, sensing the weight and warmth of countless narratives. In Iceland, ordinary neighbors, arguing, helping, scheming, and performing daily acts become immortal, ensuring that life, in all its detail, is remembered, celebrated, and shared across generations. The sagas are a testament to human observation, creativity, and the enduring power of storytelling. The night stretches around you like a thick, velvety blanket, softening the edges of hills, turf houses, and frozen rivers, and you feel the stories of Icelandic neighbors settle gently into your mind. Their disputes, clever maneuvers, accidents, and minor triumphs no longer seem distant. They float alongside the rhythm of your breathing, each tale a whisper of human ingenuity and humor. You imagine the mossy roofs, the crackling fires, and the flickering shadows as companions in this quiet journey, each neighbor immortalized by the art of observation and memory. The cold outside seems less harsh now, softened by the warmth of shared narrative. The laughter and exaggeration that have carried ordinary life across centuries. You sense how every sheep, every dropped tool, every whispered insult contributes to a larger tapestry, each thread shimmering with attention, care, and gentle exaggeration. The landscape, harsh and unyielding, provides the stage, but it is the people, their cleverness, their pettiness, their moments of generosity that animate the stories and make them endure. As your eyelids grow heavy, you let the cadence of these tales guide your thoughts, easing the tension of the day and transforming the mundane into a gentle meditation. The wind whistles softly, echoing the rhythm of sagas told beside hearths, while the memory of clever insults, heroic missteps, and neighborly triumphs dances quietly in your mind. You can almost feel the collective heartbeat of generations, the steady pulse of community preserved through story. Let yourself drift alongside these ordinary heroes, their lives amplified by imagination, humor, and attentive memory. There is comfort in knowing that even the smallest gestures, an extra loaf of bread shared, a sheep corralled, a clever quip remembered, can achieve enduring significance. Each tale folds into the next, a soft and continuous hum that eases your thoughts. Connecting past and present, neighbor and listener, reality and story. Breathe slowly, letting the warmth of peat fires, the hush of snow, and the cleverness of neighbors wrap around you. The sagas remind you that every life, however ordinary, holds potential for narrative immortality, that humor, observation, and care ensure memory's persistence. You feel the stories fading gently into quiet, the edges of Icelandic valleys softening, the voices of neighbors lingering like a gentle lullaby. Now, as your mind drifts toward sleep, carry with you the understanding that life is both ordinary and remarkable, that stories endure through attention and imagination, and that neighbors clever, foolish, and kind alike remain alive in memory long after the frost has claimed the landscape.